Please forgive my voice and my relaxed stress here. I've had COVID, and so I'm a little rusty, but I wanted to really get this one out to you. I found another micro front end that I wanted to share with you, Alpine.js. It's not going to replace spas anytime soon, but I think you'll like it for small interactions or even when you want to pair it with a spa. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so we're starting out with a pretty simple project. It's pure HTML at this point, so this is going to apply to any client-side development you want to do. What's on the server doesn't really matter in the case of what we're talking about, because I want to introduce you to Alpine.js, a very small library that's going to allow us to do some interactions. Now, I already have this running, and here it's just a really simple demo website. And I want to be able to list some films here that may have failed or passed the Bechtel test. That's a database and API that I'm working with. And I want a couple of different experiences. First, I have this menu button here that doesn't do anything currently. The menu is actually off the screen, and we'll show how to animate that in a minute with Alpine.js. I also want to be able to actually get some data for simple data scenarios, certainly not anything complex, because that's not where Alpine.js really belongs. And then finally, this little button here will make that work so that we can hide or show the description as necessary. And how are we going to do this? First, I'm going to want to bring in Alpine.js. And so the way we're going to do this is let's open up Alpine.js. And the Alpine.js project or webpage, alpinejs.dev, is really pretty simple. They show you how it works, shows you some of the properties, and it's a really small library. There's 15 attributes, 6 properties, and 2 methods. That's it. Well, let's not belabor that. Let's go to the getting started in the docs and look at the installation. And there's a couple of different ways. We could load it from an NPM package, but I'm actually just going to use the unpackaged version. So this is just a CDN for us to get this. So back here, I put in the script, and notice it says defer because we don't want this running until after the page is loaded. And with that in place, we can start to use these attributes. And so let's go to our menu. And you'll notice here that our menu has an unordered list, and this is just the list of menu options. We're using a Tailwind class here to say, make it write 8 rems or 128 pixels, essentially moving it off the screen. And we want to make that actually work. So the first thing you're going to need is something called a scope. This is basically a part of your UI, in this case, this div that contains the whole menu, that I want to have some data that I can bind to. And so we start this by saying X data, and all the attributes start with X, and X data is the first one. And I'm just going to give it a JavaScript object syntax, and I'm just going to say show menu false. So this is the state I want to start it from. And here in the unordered list, I'm going to use an X bind class. And this will allow me to specify class or classes that are set or removed based on some part of the data. So I'm just going to say show menu. And if it's true, I'm going to tell it to add a class called show. Otherwise, I'm going to tell it not to list a class. Now, you could have either number of classes or none. So we have this class adding or removing itself from this unordered list based on this data. So now we have to change that data. And so here on the div, which could be a button or anything else, we want to use XON. XON means I'm going to run something when an event happens. And in our case, that'll be when someone clicks on this element, what do I want to do? I want to say show menu equals not show menu. So just toggle the true to false or false to the true, etc. And in fact, XON can be shortened to just at, which if you're in the view world, you'll be very familiar with that syntax. It's the same syntax. So with that change, let's come back over here. We can see that the menu is now working, right? This menu is being shown and hidden every time we click on it. So this is a very simple interaction. We want to show or hide a menu, and I'm not doing the best job in how we're showing and hiding it, but it's enough for us to see this menu come in and out of our view as we click it. Very simple interaction that you could certainly write with some JavaScript, but this allows us to do it pretty easily without having to worry about it. Let's do something more complicated. So in this main section, I have this object here, this div that represents one of those big panels. And I'm using 3 grid columns in order to show them on the screen. We only have 1 so far, so we're only seeing 1. And if I were to make a copy of this you'll see I get 2 and I would eventually get 3 of these on the screen. So we've come down here and we have that single movie element here, and I'd like to be able to show more than one of them and eventually actually bind some data. But let's start by creating a template element. And I'm going to put this template around the element we want to repeat, and we're going to use a new attribute called x4. In this case, we're just going to do it numerically, 1 in 10. If we come back here and look at the demo, nothing's changed. In fact, that template is not being shown at all. What we need to do here is have something called a scope. And we did this earlier by creating a data element that we were going to use to bind, right? Well, we still need a data element here because that's what defines a scope, or more importantly, tells Alpine that you want it to start scanning this part of the document, this node and everything inside of it. Otherwise, it ignores. Like, it's not constantly looking for these random things. It's requiring that you input what parts of the UI you want it to look like. And as we see here, we can have more than one of these on an individual page. Individual components could be using them. You can even nest them. And so here for X data, I'm just going to say empty object. We're going to come back and put some stuff in there, but we're not actually binding. We're just repeating, right? And if we come back here, it's doing exactly that. We're getting 10 of these objects bound here. So we're getting that sort of repeating based on a collection that we might want. So now that we have it just working in this 410, let's make it a little better. Let's change this to have some data. And I'm going to create a collection, or actually an array of films. Has no objects in it here. And I'm going to change this from film in films, right? We're telling it that we want to repeat this section with every item in films, and then we're going to be given a variable called film that we can get those individual objects from. But the problem here is that because there's no objects in here, if we go back to the browser, we can see that none of them show up now because that array is 0 and none are being generated because there's nothing in that array. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated on purpose, right? Normally you would do this in a script and then allow Alpine to bind against the data you would get in the script. But I want to show you the power of it here. Can actually use a attribute called xinit, and this attribute says run some code when this scope initializes, right? When it just starts up. And I'm going to use something a little bit more complicated. I'm going to assign the films to a result of a REST call, right? And so if I do await Axios, which I'm using for the request, I can actually give it some address. And in this case, it's going to be Bechtel.azurewebsites.net. This is an API I've exposed. You can actually go look at Bechtel.azurewebsites.net. And I'm going to look for films from 1994. This will return all the films it has, or at least the first page of the results that it has here, and will let us display information like we already have in this sort of placeholder. Now, this is going to get it and return it, but we actually need to do something with it. So I'm just going to attach on the back of it because we're using await. We can do that by just saying data, which is the name of the results from Axios calls, and then I'm going to get an object from it called results. I'm going to assign it these results. So there's a lot of code here in one little line, and it's a bit terse. Let's look at the API call. And when I make this same call to 1994, I get a result that has a couple of properties, how many pages, how many counts, and then each of these results is all the information I need for a particular film. And so I'm telling it to bind to the collection of the 26 items it's returning and assigning that directly to the films. So that now, if we just look at the browser, I've just made this small change, we'll see that we're going to get exactly 26 results here. But of course, all of this still says Shawshank because we haven't done any of the binding. So quickly, let's look at the binding. Let's open up our template here. And if I just get rid of Shawshank, which I don't actually need to, but it makes it a little clearer, I can actually assign the text from film.title, right? Because this is a temporary variable for each iteration of this. If I come back here, we can now see Ace Ventura, Beverly Hills Cop, Clerks, etc. A bunch of films directly from the API. So let's do it for the entire object so we can actually see this work. So here, instead of the source, I'm able to use xbind to bind to any attribute with data, right? And so because I'm using xbind against the source, so after the colon is going to be the name of the native attribute you want to set, I'm just going to say film.poster_URL. I happen to know is the URL for the poster, and then I can do the same with all of these. I could say x text equals film.year. I'll do a little copy and paste to make this a little quicker. This is going to be rating. And this is going to be passed, which is whether it has passed or not, the Bechtel test. And then down here in description, we can do the same thing, even though this is going to be a longer piece of text. We can just say X test, and of course this is going to be overview, not description in our case, but we can get a sense of that. Back in the browser, we're starting to see this actually work, right? We're seeing all the binding very quickly, take that init call and do this. And of course, you can make this more complex with script if you want, but again, this is for those small pieces. And I'm only showing you this methodology because I want to show you the power of it. It is not a best practice, but it does show some of the power of this. So let's add the last piece, which is this little button. And you'll see in each description that we have that button, and then we have this section for description, right? And so what we really want to do is have our own data. Again, a scope is important here because this is nested in the other scope. But once you make a scope in one of these sections, it becomes responsible for all the elements. And you can have overlapping or nested scopes. So let's give it a try. So here on this div that has the flex in it, let's go ahead and add another data. And this is going to be a data per box. It's not going to be one that handles the whole thing. And this is more simplistic, but there is going to be more code running when you do this. And I'm just going to say is open false, right? Just like we did at the top. But in this case, we're going to go down to our overview and we're going to say x bind class, and just like we did before, we're going to decide whether to show it or not. And we could define a class here that determined whether it was shown or hidden, especially if we want animations in CSS. That makes a lot of sense. But in our case, we don't need any of that fanciness, so we're just going to use xShow, and xShow is going to allow it to be hidden or shown directly based on some data. So I can just say is open here, right? Since this is false and this is open, and if we come back here, you can see our description is there, but that piece is missing that's showing the data. And so let's make this button actually show and hide it. We can do that with a couple of different things. First, I'm going to add a @click. Remember that's X on underneath the covers. And I'm just going to say is open equals, just like I did before, is open, is not open, right? If we do that, we can now click on this and it'll hide and show it. Notice it doesn't do it for all of them because each one of these is now a scope. And that even though this is inside the scope, it's still correctly knowing that the film is there, therefore we can use it here. So it's rather clever that scopes don't override each other. And the last thing I want to do is actually just a bit of housekeeping, right? I want to say X text, and I want to change the text here based on is open. So if it is open, what am I going to do? I'm going to say less than, else, greater than, right? I'm just allowing it to specify the text of this button as less than or greater than. So we look in this, we can now see we're getting this action button not only showing and hiding, but we're changing the text for a lot of the work that you may be used to doing in vanilla JavaScript or even jQuery. This allows us to do a lot of these simple interactions directly from our code here. And if you have scripts that are running on the page, this code also has access to them. One of the common patterns here is for something complex to bind the data to a function that you've written that returns some object that has that data. And that becomes pretty useful, but I didn't want to show that and complicate it because I really think this is mostly going to be used for simple scenarios where you just need some interactions. Because it's so small, you can do this in very convenient ways. Well, you've gotten to the end of another coding short. Thanks for sticking with me. This is Sean Wildermuth, and if you like what you've seen, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Please put your comments down below. If you want to ask questions, if you want to tell me I'm doing it wrong, all of that is fair game down in the comments, and I try to answer them as quickly as possible. So until next time, this has been Sean Wildermuth with Coding Shorts.